Hello, my name is Lisa Schoenberg, and I'm from the philosophy department at the Slippery Rock University of Pennsylvania. This is my first time at AAPT, and I'm going to be presenting on listening. This relates to a series of experiences that I've had over the past couple of years teaching a course in civil discourse based in the philosophy department. We recently had a revision of our Gen Ed program, and the traditional speech class, which was offered by the communications department, morphed into three different courses offered by three different departments, one of which was ours. So this was an opportunity for us to get another course into the general education program, one that focused in this case on speech. But I found in my experiences of teaching the course that where I really wanted to emphasize, what I really wanted to emphasize for students was not so much the speaking as the listening part of civil discourse. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that in my presentation. So you might ask, why? Why am I prioritizing or emphasizing listening? It's a public speech class, or it's what it traditionally would have been a speech class. And speech is something certainly students need to work on. A lot of them are anxious about public speaking. A lot of students need to learn a little bit about how to make their public speaking a little more professional. So why am I emphasizing instead listening? Or on the other hand, why not emphasize both, right? Speaking and listening are both equally important in civil discourse. It requires a speaker and a listener who are interacting in their discourse and interacting in a certain kind of fashion. In addition, I had a HIP learning, high impact learning practice designation for the course in collaborative learning that I managed to get in there last year. Collaborative learning also is kind of two-sided, right? It requires people working together, and so it requires people to speak and listen, right? And of course, much of the good stuff in the philosophy class takes place in discussion between students and the professor. So all of that is taking place in between people, right? So in the middle place. So why not emphasize both? So of course that's true, and of course a speech class is going to have speech. But in my experience, listening is undertaught and undervalued. And when something's undervalued by professors, students put less work into it and don't try to explore it as much. Students are graded. They're evaluated based on the contributions they make, not on how much they listen to what other students might have to say. Of course, the contributions they make are going to involve listening and reading other people and other sources, and how they reflect those sources that they're using will be a part of their evaluation, but that's very indirect. And I think that what generally happens is that the between space between speaker and listener in a class contains genuine listening often, but not always. And certain students and viewpoints tend to dominate. And when students are thinking about what they're going to say next, when they're listening, when they're listening to someone else speak, what they're often thinking about is what they're going to say next, and not necessarily what they're hearing, right? Like, I'm listening to someone and I want to know how I can respond to that, or how I can make a unique contribution to this discussion, and not so much trying to understand or value what the other person is saying. And because of that, I decided that I really wanted to have a number of assignments which prioritize listening rather than speaking. So, obviously motivated reasoning is something we hear a lot about, and a lot of research has been done in the last 20 years about motivated reasoning and how techniques that teach people how to evaluate information actually often lead to people just kind of clutching to the beliefs they already have even more tightly, and evidence causes them to clutch more tightly to the beliefs that they already have. That's pretty much equivalent to not being a very good listener, right, or reader. And I want to get students away from motivated reasoning. I actually had a lot of experience teaching critical thinking. That was kind of my mainstay course when I was at another institution. And I discovered decades ago when I first started teaching it that the more that I taught students how to engage in critical thinking, the less I really had an opportunity to convince them of anything, right? So they learned how to argue well, and that became a way to argue for their own positions better. They learned how to criticize, but that became a way for them to criticize the positions they didn't agree with in a deeper way. It didn't really get them to be more critical about their own beliefs. It became a kind of defense mechanism. So I decided at the time that the way to get students to really be great great reasonable or rational thinkers was to get them to open up rather than to be open, to be accepting and listening rather than to be critical and kind of attacking. And so that kind of experience also influenced my view that what I wanted to do in the speech course was talk about listening rather than about speaking. So I've developed this term motivated listening, kind of to distinguish it from motivated reasoning. But the word motivated kind of hints that the motivated listener is purposeful, that they have a motivation for what they're doing. They're not just kind of passively listening because they're in a class. They're not kind of waiting for the lull in which they might speak. They're motivated, and they have to be motivated by something, right? And that motivation could be internal if they're naturally curious about the conversation, but students aren't always in a place where at that moment they're naturally curious. So how do we get them to be motivated in the act of listening? That's something I wanted to explore. So there's a lot of research on this idea of curiosity. There's an interesting study out recently about how curiosity is something that kind of suppresses motivated reasoning, whereas logic and skill and argumentative technique kind of magnifies the word that the Dan Cahan and Ashley Landrum work, kind of magnify their motivated reasoning, but it's suppressed by curiosity. And curiosity here is described by Dan Cahan and Ashley Landrum as being as being somebody who would display a marked preference for surprising information. That is information that's contrary to what they expect, something that would kind of shock them. But they're looking for that. They want that experience of finding something surprising, and they kind of enjoy being disappointed. So how can you get students to the point where they're not looking for things that they already expect to kind of, support or, build up their viewpoint, but that they're actually looking for things that not only looking because they're supposed to, but they actually enjoy looking for things that will disappoint their expectations. And can that even be taught, is an interesting question that I'm trying to explore. So trying to get my students to work on motivated listening, I found that a few factors make it work better in the classroom. So first of all, I have to explicitly require it. I can't assume that students will naturally or automatically be motivated listeners, at least not at first. I mean, of course, the point is to eventually get them there. So I've actually created assignments in which speaking and listening are both a part of the assignment. They're sequential, they're separate. It's not just a discussion where there's back and forth and it's kind of supposed to be there naturally. It actually has to be sequential so that each student takes that role of listening. And I have to emphasize both, right? Listening is not just the other side of speaking, and speaking is the part that's important. I have to emphasize both. Secondly, you have to give stakes to listening. So students aren't going to be fully invested in activities where there's no clear purpose. Listening is not generally evaluated. It's not a part of the coursework. It's not explicitly spelled out. So, of course, they're not going to be invested because it's not important. But of course, grades are one kind of stake. Ideally, you don't want the stake to just be grades. I mean, it's better than not even asking them to listen and giving any evaluation to that. But ultimately, I would prefer it to be authentic so that the task in which students are listening is actually meaningful, and that hopefully will engage them in true curiosity because it's not artificial and forced. They see the purpose and role for it. They're not just doing it because they know that's what you want them to do. So let's talk about the couple assignments that I've developed that are part of my collaborative learning designation that focus on at least partly on listening. And it might not be totally obvious, but the second one does. The first one is pretty clearly a listening assignment. But both involve listening in a substantial way. So the first thing is a kind of interview project, which I could also call kind of a reverse debate. Debating is definitely related to motivated reasoning, right? If I'm debating, I'm very motivated to defend my point of view. And even if I'm looking at if I end up with a point of view I don't agree with, I'm going to spend most of my time thinking, oh, well, how would I respond to this argument? So it's intended to be kind of a reverse of that. And then I have an in-class ethics bowl, which originally was a part of our course because we wanted to support our ethics bowl competitions on campus, outside the classroom. But I found it worked really well, and I kind of over the semesters played with it a little bit until I ended up with a system in which I begin with individual competitors rather than teams, and then I proceed over time to teams and end up with a winner at the end of the semester. So the interview is the first assignment of the semester, and for that reason, it kind of only begins to get students where I'd like them to be on this issue, and I'm still playing with it. I don't have it perfectly developed at this point, but I think it's worked fairly well, even if it's not perfectly developed. So the idea is to assign students partners with whom they disagree about something important. And actually, the most difficult step of this entire process is getting the partners and topics assigned. So it's ideal to make this very authentic. But if you're dealing with students who don't necessarily have strong opinions, and there are actually surprisingly a lot of them at my institution, I've had students work with a partner and then decide they don't disagree on anything, right? They agree on absolutely everything. And I think politeness plays a role there. But also students haven't always really investigated all their beliefs, and they're not even sure what they believe when they arrive at college. And I'm working with a lot of first-year students. So I've been working hard on trying to get this assignment of partners and topics a little bit, to go a little bit more smoothly. Ultimately, I think when we were out with COVID, I had to do it kind of remotely. But when we're back in the classroom, I'm going to work on devoting a whole class to it. That's what it takes in order to get it to work, right? So then I have the students interview each other in order to fully understand each other's positions. And at first I did this without a questionnaire, then I developed a questionnaire, and now I keep lengthening the questionnaire, and I ask the students to submit it so that I'm sure that they actually did interview each other. And it wasn't that one person ended up doing the work for the other, finding out what their belief is by doing their own independent research. So the questionnaire, which I'm going to provide so you can look it over if you're curious, includes questions trying to get at different angles at why somebody believes what they do. So like in any interview, the questions could be lead to somewhat repetitive answers, but the point is to try to get at the underlying stuff that causes people to believe something. So, questions about the evolution of their point of view, which really aren't relevant to the strength of the argument, of course, but can be very interesting and contain biological information. I've had students, interview, especially when they teach over winter and when they take the class over winter and summer, they can't really work with somebody in the class. So I've had them interview family members and get some really interesting stuff about the family members' past experiences on something. And so it really can lead to some interesting stuff. Also, their factual beliefs that support their point of view. What do they believe to be true, right? What do they believe to be a support of their point of view, which might not be true, of course, but at least investigate what those beliefs might be, what they might be, right? Their underlying moral and political assumptions, and of course, that's difficult for students to really pin down. Can you interview somebody and find out what is the underlying belief that causes them to have the higher level belief about abortion or the death penalty or something like that? And their potential response to counter arguments. And so it's important to try to get that potential response to be discussed without then becoming a debate. Because the very idea of the reverse debate is to not debate, right? Is to try to empathize and understand and not to engage in a kind of back and forth. So at the end of this, the students give a speech in which they present without any straw persons and with intellectual empathy their partner's views. In a way, they're kind of introducing their partner to the class because it's the beginning of the semester through this interview, through what they found out about their beliefs about this important topic. And they're not to argue for it. It's an introduction, it's a description. Because if they were arguing, they would be playing devil's advocate because it's a side they don't agree with. And I don't want them to argue. At the same time, I don't want them to respond, right? Because then we're getting into a debate and it becomes motivated reasoning territory if they're responding to their partner's arguments. And it's a little sweet spot there, but I think it works to get the students into that little narrow area. So the assignment is process-based. It doesn't have a predetermined artificial end. So sometimes it turns out I made a wrong assignment and the students actually agree, which is fine. Maybe they turn out to agree. Somebody might not have had a very strong opinion and they get swayed. somebody else might be change their mind through genuinely analyzing the issue and thinking it through in a little bit more detail. All that's fine. They should get where they get. That's the authenticity portion. So if they in the end agree completely, then that's what they should say, right? It's not a debate. But if they continue to disagree, I do ask them to kind of figure out what the core of their disagreement is, to analyze it a little bit more in detail, because of course that would affect how they might be able to come to a compromise or agree with each other on the issue or agree with some part of the issue or explore the issue further and try to get an answer. And obviously, if they disagree mainly on facts, they could research those facts. If they disagree on empirical matters that we don't know at this time, like, say, the effect of something that has to unfold in the future, so we don't know for instance, what would a particular technique solve a problem? We don't know if it would because we haven't tried that technique, but somebody thinks it would, another person thinks it would not. That's the kind of thing I'd like to be able to get them to pin down. Or do they agree on basic principles, other ethical ideas they have that are very different that underlie their view? And I'm working on, given this research on curiosity, asking students to explicitly become curious about some important aspect of their opponent's views and really try to explore it, to incorporate the idea of curiosity very specifically to see if we can teach it. Maybe we can't, but I want to try. So that's the first assignment. Now, I do a bunch of assignments in the middle, so this is not the entirety of the class, but the last assignment of the semester, I run an ethics bowl. Now, you might think that's mainly speaking, but there's some important learning components. And by the time we get here, I feel like those learning components, because of what we've done before, really work. They really work better than they do in the first assignment. So what I do in the in-class ethics bowl is, first of all, I already divided the class into teams earlier on in the semester, and the teams compete. Okay, the idea is to have like a winning team. Each team in my class would end up being about 9 students because I have 36 students, so divided by 4. But in the first round, I actually have them compete as individuals within the team, so only against their 9 teammates or their 8 teammates. The purpose of this is to get each student to participate fully. I wouldn't have done it this way if it weren't for COVID. I started doing it during COVID, and because I couldn't run it all in Zoom, and I wanted to do some of it in the discussion board, but it worked extremely well, and I'm not going to stop because each student got a chance to really fully do it. Whereas when I've done it before in class, some students don't speak up as much as others. And this really helps students, kind of flower and grow when they become more confident doing it. I have them choose their own case out of hundreds of past cases, and then they have ownership of their case. And I'll talk about that in a minute. I think having ownership of some piece of something is very important for students who are particularly quiet in class and don't feel like they have a lot to say, because you've given them ownership of this. They're the only ones that can speak to it. So it's kind of like an instance of the bystander effect. If you know somebody else is going to speak to something, if you're very, shy or you have anxiety about speaking, then you will wait and let them do it. But if you know you're the only one that can do it, you're the only one who can because you are the expert in it, then that gives you the confidence to know that what you are about to say is important. And as somebody who didn't speak virtually at all in college and since adolescent up until graduate school, I found that really works. I have a lot of empathy for students who have trouble speaking, and I find that it really works. So anyway, they present the case in writing to the discussion board, and then they comment and ask questions of each other's entries into the competition. So because they have to comment and ask questions, this is listening, right? And it has an authentic, meaningful purpose because there's a competition, right? And somebody's going to win. And they know that they have something to add, like there's the ownership piece again, because if I'm commenting on your piece, I'm helping you to develop what you are doing, right? So although I'm competing, I'm collaborating because I'm helping you in your competition. So I have a purpose to what I'm doing. I'm helping you, right? I'm helping you develop your ideas. And then lastly, I have students do the judging. It's worked extremely well. I actually have been quite pleased with how seriously they take it. It's actually, it's really wonderful to see how seriously they take the judging and how important it is to them. They score each of their teammates' entries, so that would be 8 other students because they're in groups of 9. And again, that means that they're listening with an authentic, meaningful purpose. They're reading the discussion board entries because they have to make an assessment of who's going to represent them in the competition. And that gives the listening such importance to them that they take it quite seriously. So then there's the last assignment of the semester. Then there's the second and third round of the last assignment of the semester, which is the semifinal and final rounds of the ethics bowl. And this I've been doing synchronously in Zoom. I'm going to go back and do it in class soon. And the top scores from each team present cases on behalf of their teammates. So that would be the 3 top scores of each team of 9, which the 3 top scores are judged and picked by the students, not by me. So the students now are very familiar with how to do this. They've been doing stuff like this all semester. There are other assignments that get them to the point of being able to do this as well. And they're confident enough to collaborate. So now collaboration, I think collaborative learning is wonderful, but students often need help to get to the point where they're truly collaborative, in which every student is participating to the best of their ability. So I don't no longer have to give roles and lots of instructions. I don't have to give them a questionnaire. I don't have to have somebody be the one doing the entry and somebody doing the commenting. I just give it to them to do. And it took a long time to get to here, but the students do really take over. And when I've done this in Zoom in the past couple semesters, 3 semesters since the beginning of COVID, I don't say anything. I become invisible. And I'll say time's up. When time's up, that's it. So the students who aren't participating do the judging, selecting the 2 semifinalists and then the winner. So they're listening again with stakes and a meaningful purpose because they're going to be picking the winner, right? Not me. And there has to be a winner because that's the authenticity of it, right? The competitive nature of the ethics bowl is part of what makes it meaningful and enjoyable. And the fact that ethics bowls are a real thing outside the classroom also kind of lends a flavor to its authenticity. Students haven't done it before, but they're like, oh, this is what this is. And it relates to something real. It's not something artificial that I created. So those are the collaborative learning / listening assignments that I do in my civil discourse class. And some final thoughts. It takes a whole semester to get students to the point where they can genuinely collaborate, rather than acting like they're just collaborating for my sake or for my ears or in order to get a grade. But it is very rewarding when I get there, right? At the end of the semester, it's very rewarding. So if students, if curiosity is what gets students to open up their minds and begin to maybe take seriously points of view they hadn't taken seriously before, if it's the joy we feel at encountering something new and surprising, like we don't reject the new and surprising, we want to welcome it, how do we get to the point where we get students to feel that joy? And I don't think we can get there by beginning with critical engagement of ideas. I think we have to get there kind of with a more invitational attitude, bringing students into a kind of experience that's pleasurable and enjoyable. And that is what I have to say about my experience of trying to get students to be better listeners, motivated listeners in my civil discourse class. So I look forward to having a discussion when we meet in a couple weeks.